Kenya is violating international law by forcing residents of the world's largest refugee camp to return to Somalia. Now, this is according to aid agency, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and Kenya insists the emptying of Dadaab, home to hundreds of thousands of mostly Somali refugees, is being carried out in line with the international law. But the NRC says the voluntary returns process does not meet international standards.
To reinstate voluntary, safe and dignified returns for the Dadaab refugee community, NGO, the Norwegian Refugee Council, slammed Kenya for what it says is the violation of international law by forcefully removing residents of the world's largest refugee camp.
The issue is that the focus on returning as many as possible, although the system of voluntary return is theoretically still voluntary, actually because of the pressure that the refugees are feeling in order that they must go back, means that they're joining the voluntary return process even though they may not want to go back at this time.
Kenya insists the emptying of Dadaab, home to hundreds of thousands of mostly Somali refugees, is being carried out in line with international law. As the report by the NRC stands, Kenya could be guilty under international law of the forcible return of refugees or asylum seekers.
The number of returns that we've had through the voluntary return process this year is about 25,000. And the number of spontaneous returns that we've seen are 12,000. And what we really want to focus in on is the fact that these refugees are not being able to make a good choice in terms of how they return. And when they return to Somalia, it's creating problems for them there because they can't necessarily go back to the places that they want to go back to.
The government announced in May that the vast Dadaab camp in northeast Kenya would be shut down, citing security concerns. Authorities have repeatedly alleged that the camp is a breeding ground for Islamic terrorism, but has not provided evidence to back the claims. The NRC said that apart from the involuntary nature of the returns, the volatile security situation in Somalia means the refugees going back cannot be guaranteed protection, while basic services there are inadequate.
We're calling for several things. The first is that the deadline that the Kenya government has set for the returns to happen, which is November, is unrealistic and is also putting pressure on the refugees to join the voluntary return program without actually making an informed choice.
Kenya has dismissed reports of abuse in the camps and reaffirmed its plans to close the world's largest refugee camp by November. Bureau Report, ANN7.
Joining me on the phone line now is Otilia Maunganize. She is from the Migration Program. Otilia, thank you so much for joining us here on Africa Tonight. We certainly appreciate it. And perhaps you could shed some light for us and our viewers as to why the Kenyan government announced that it would be closing down Dadaab's 5 camps by the end of this month.
Thank you for having me. And just to clarify, I am with the Institute for Security Studies, and the program is within the Institute. So the Kenyan government has cited a range of reasons as to why it needs to close down Dadaab. One of the reasons is that the camp, which now holds over 280,000 refugees, should not exist, and that it has far too many people, and people ought to have been relocated, at least not just outside of Kenya, but also within Kenya by now. But at the same time, they have raised concerns around security concerns, including still yet unsubstantiated views that Al-Shabaab is using the refugee camp to recruit people to commit terrorist attacks.
Is this within international law? Because it appears they're forcing residents, of the world's largest camp to return back to their home country, which is Somalia. Is it well within the legal frameworks of the laws?
Right. So we need to take a step back a bit. The repatriation or sending back of people to their countries on its own voluntarily is not illegal. So in terms of the tripartite agreement going back to 2013, Kenya, together with Somalia and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, agreed that there would be a need for voluntary return. Now, the problem comes in where that return is not voluntary. Now, what we are hearing at the moment is while a number of the people have volunteered to go back and have been given, you know, the $400 and so forth to be allowed to go back to Somalia, there are quite a number who haven't volunteered, but rather have been essentially forced to return to Somalia. Now, it is for those people that have been forced to go back to Somalia, if we're able to prove that, where that is against international humanitarian law, but it is also against international criminal law, which essentially says that forced deportations are illegal.
Right, that was going to be my next question to you. If you have received any reports of intimidation or coercion of the refugees to return to Somalia. Obviously, there's no evidence at this point, but in terms of humanitarian aid, is it still coming through, or is that also closed as we speak?
So there is humanitarian aid, at least that is being offered through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as the World Food Programme. So people are receiving some aid. The challenge, though, is whether or not this is at the levels of aid that have been received in Dadaab since it was opened. And what we have seen over the past 3 years, at least, is a scaling down of services and also a scaling down of funds made available to Dadaab. So there are concerns there in terms of whether or not people are receiving the right amount of aid. But that responsibility, dare I add, is not a responsibility only for the Kenyan government. It is also a responsibility for the humanitarian community. And so far there have been some pledges, but they have been limited in that they haven't really given direct funding to allow for that humanitarian assistance to reach each and every person that is in the Dadaab camp. Right.
Chiliya Maunganidze, the senior researcher at the Institute of Security Studies in South Africa. Thank you so much for your time. We certainly appreciate your analysis into this issue.